A rambling, incoherent response, were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought?
All right, welcome to the show today, the Author Brand Show. I'm your host, Doug Crowe. You're going to want to take notes, especially in this hot topic today. Our guest today is Senior VP and Chief Customer Officer at Modaxo Americas. It's one of the world's largest transit technology companies. Host of his own podcast called Transit Unplugged. Heard in over 100 countries. He's got a YouTube sensation called Transit Unplugged. Who would have known? He's authored 3 best-selling books. The most recent one is called Conversations on Equity and Inclusion in Public Transportation. Fascinating idea. He serves as an executive director of the North American Transit Alliance. He's an attorney, but he's still a good guy. Popular keynote speaker and former CEO of one of America's largest transit systems, the Maryland Transit Administration in Baltimore. So his resume goes on and on here. We could spend half the show on this. He's recipient of the USA's top individual transportation honor, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. That's called AASHTO, AASHTO. I'm not going to say it too fast. President's Award. Welcome to the show today, best-selling author Paul Comfort.
Be with you, my friend.
How you doing?
Great, man. Good
to see you. So, wow, I want to hear more about this topic of yours. But before we do, tell people why they should listen to us for the next 20 minutes. What's in it for them?
Well, it'll be fun and entertaining. But other than that, I think, public transportation is not something that's at front of mind for a lot of people, right? Especially in places like Charleston, South Carolina, where you're at.
That's right.
But it is important, and millions of people rely on it every day. And if you don't ride public transit, you should be thankful for it, because it takes thousands of cars off the road, which makes it easier for you to get around in your city. If we didn't have public transit, cities would be even more congested than they are today. Doug, I just got back from Singapore last month, where I visited and did a television show, which just dropped this week on Transit Unplugged TV on YouTube. And they charge $100,000 for a license to have a car in the city. Right. It's a 10-year license, and it reduces the number of vehicles that are on the roads there by dramatically. It's one of the ways they put people on public transportation, and they've got an amazing public transit system. Sure. But here in the U.S., every city in the country has one. We're going to talk about it today, how it's changed over the pandemic and what the future looks like.
That's great. Okay, yeah. It reminds me that one scene in a Mission Impossible movie where Tom Cruise is talking about the life cycle of transportation. And the guy's like, "Oh, this is really boring." And the girl's like, "Oh, I'd marry him." It was really good. So I'm just so curious if there's actually a YouTube show and a Transit Unplugged show. 100 countries listen to your show about transportation. So
can you believe that? Somebody, I get emails from people from South Africa to Singapore to Malaysia. Everyone's listening to this because it's an important topic for a lot of people. And we interview CEOs of transit systems. Okay. That's what our unique angle is. Since I was a CEO, I'm part of the club. And so 6 years now in, they're lined up at the door to come on the podcast.
Terrific. That's great. So hold your book up a second. We're talking about this book, man.
Sure, yeah.
Author Brand Show. Conversations on Equity and Inclusion in Public Transportation. Who would have thunk that the meter had a problem with the color of somebody's skin to get on a bus, right? It's,
So, back to Rosa Parks, right? Yeah, that hasn't really been the issue, but we'll dig into it in a minute. But it just public transit needs to expand its base, and it primarily, to be honest with you, in the big cities. Let's say the big 50 cities in the United States, it's been a lot about commuter transportation. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. So I was CEO of Baltimore's transit system, and we had a bus system, we had a light rail system, we had a subway, we had a commuter train that takes people into Washington, D.C., and we had 350 commuter buses that took people into Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis. And we had a paratransit system. But a lot of the focus was on the commuter service, the white collar workers going into downtown Washington, D.C. to get on the train, go there, and then go out to their big, tall buildings in the downtown for their jobs in the federal government or whatever. During the pandemic, Doug, ridership was decimated, right? I don't know if you remember, but people were telling the government officials were telling people don't ride transit unless you're, quote, an essential worker, which I never liked that term. I think most work is essential, but we get the drift. People that run the hospitals, the water plants, et cetera.
And the liquor stores. Don't forget the liquor stores.
That's right.
Essential too.
Very essential during these times, I'm sure. But so ridership went down to about 50%, but it still was at 50%, showing that the people who ride the bus, kind of the wheels in the bus that go round and round, are also the wheels in the bus that make our economy turn, because these people that are the frontline troops of our economy. But the commuter services like Mark Train that I used to run in the commuter buses, decimated. Down to 5%, 95% reduction in ridership. Wow. A lot of times the routes were just canceled because no one was riding. You weren't allowed to ride. You weren't allowed to go to your office. So, so during that time, public transit officials across America, Canada, and really Western Europe in general took a moment to reflect on what's our purpose. Is our purpose primarily to focus on commuters, or is it more than that? And they basically came down. There was a survey done by the American Public Transportation Association where they asked them, is ridership still your number one KPI, your key performance indicator? And it wasn't. For the first time in 50 years, it had dropped to number 2. Number 1 was the customer experience, our customer service to where they want. And number 3 was new modes of transportation. We could talk about that. Autonomous buses, microtransit, the new scooters you see dumped all over your city, the bikes. We could talk about that's all part of the ecosystem now of public transport in cities. They call it public mobility now, not just transit, it's mobility. It's private players, Uber, Lyft, the others, all combined in to create options for people in mobility. And then the second big thing, so transit agencies figured out, you know what, we're not just about ridership anymore. If we are, we're a dismal failure because only half the people are riding. So let's focus on what we can do. And what we can focus on is we can actually use transit to improve the environment. All right. Buses have always been cleaner, even if they're dirty diesel. It's cleaner than 100 cars running on the road that it takes off the road. Each bus does, as I mentioned earlier. But now they're moving to electric buses, hydrogen-powered buses. Yeah, you got it. And then the second big factor that they focused on was, why don't we use these agencies that are already in place to promote overall societal good? And that could be basically equity and inclusion. What does that mean? Well, to me, it means people that have been traditionally disenfranchised, give them an extra hand up. I spent a lot of my career, Doug, working with people with disabilities. I ran Washington, D.C.'s paratransit system for 5 years.
Nice.
And, we served 10,000 people a day with disabilities, taking them to their jobs and all that with small vans, picking them up at their house, taking them where they want to go under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So to me, this is an extension of that, right? So people with disabilities, they rely on public transportation probably more than most, right? If they don't have it, they might be stuck at home.
Right.
Well, people that are traditionally disenfranchised, the services really haven't been geared toward them. I'll give you a couple examples. In New Orleans, good friend of mine, Alex Wiggins, ran that transit system. In Richmond, good friend of mine, Julie Tim, ran that system. Now she runs Sound Transit in Seattle. But Julie told me in Richmond, all of her bus shelters would keep people out of the rain. They were in the downtown area, the central business district, for the white-collar workers. But the people of color, people of low income, maybe elderly, disabled, that were out in the communities, the hinterland, so to speak, they just got what I would call a stick in the mud, right? It's a pole with a sign that says bus stop. So they have to stand there for a half hour in the rain waiting for the bus, whereas the downtown folks, so you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that really has been a focus. And the other big thing is that commuter routes had what we call higher headways, faster headways, meaning the distance between the buses was shorter. A headway is the distance between buses. Okay. So you may get a bus coming every 10, 15 minutes if you're going to downtown. But if you're out in the country, a bus may come once an hour.
Right.
That's not really right. I mean, people can't rely on that. A lot of times the buses are late, or like in our case in Baltimore, a lot of times never even showed because the route got cut, especially on Monday mornings after NFL games. Yeah. So we had to fix that there. But so these are the kind of things. So increasing those headways, giving some of these routes that serve traditionally underserved communities a little more service, a better experience, customer experience. That is what the conversations are about. My book is actually 20 top leaders saying what they're doing right now to improve equity inclusion in their agency as well. So that's a little bit about what's happening in transit.
I love it. Yeah, the nice shelter versus the stick in the mud is a really good example. And that's like, okay, I can see that. Give me some other examples of that, because normally I look at things like this and like, okay, so what's the problem? Everybody can get on a bus. I mentioned the Rosa Parks thing, but the experience you mentioned, I think it's really interesting. So besides the bus stop, what other areas are being improved across the country?
Yeah, one of the big areas that's happening right now is what they're calling zero fare. So, traditionally transit has been seen like what's a good example? I would say
Like the post office, right? It's been
yeah,
supplemented.
exactly. It pays for itself, so to speak, with a little bit of subsidy. And it's gotten more and more subsidized over the last few years. When I took over the MTA in Baltimore, we were 50% fare box recovery.
Okay.
And the General Assembly said, we know it's difficult for you to meet that, so we're going to let you cut that back a little bit. But some cities like Kansas City and now even Washington, D.C. has just voted to do this. Getting on the bus would be free. And that helps people of low income, people who maybe or even moderate income who don't have $100 a month to ride, getting one of those cards to ride frequent flyer, so to speak. So those are things that transit agencies are looking at all over the country, big cities and small towns alike, working on ways to make public transportation more accessible, meaning more service, right? And then the other big thing they're doing for more service is what's called microtransit or on-demand service. So if you move a bus route, Doug, to let's say you put in place some base expectations. We can't afford to run a 40-foot bus down this street unless so many people ride per day. Doesn't make sense.
Yep.
So a lot of cities after COVID especially have said ridership patterns have changed dramatically. There's what they call 3-day cities now where people are only going to work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Sure.
And so on Mondays and Fridays, why are we running all these buses down these streets at these high costs when there's nobody riding on those days? Okay, yeah, but you're still leaving Aunt Susan there, and she needs to get to her bridge game, or to her hospital, or to her job, or whatever. So microtransit or on-demand transit has been started up all over the country. It's basically small vans, kind of like what you might call an Uber pool vehicle.
Yeah.
And people can book it online. It'll come to your curb in front of your house. You come out, get in, then it picks up somebody else down the street, somebody else, and then it drops them off. Yeah. It's traditionally for people with disabilities, that's what we've been doing for them, paratransit. Now cities are doing it for able-bodied people, so to speak. And now the biggest trend is that because they've been doing that for a couple of years and they're running their paratransit, cities like Seattle and Dallas and other cities are looking at combining them. I just talked to the CEO of a major transit system when I was in DC this week, and she was saying that they're looking at doing it. Why are we running two separate microtransit systems now? Let's pull them together. Sure. And then you bring in this whole concept of adding in the bikes, the scooters, going to a mobility as a service app, a mass app on your phone, where you can plan, book, and pay for all your services on that app. So a guy might get up in the morning, have an Uber pick him up at his house, take him to the train station, get on the train, take it downtown, and then get on a bike and ride the last 4 blocks to his office. Yep. It can all be planned for and paid for like Denver does on an app, or like Dallas does. Yeah. And you push a button and you scan your little UPC symbol on their validator, and it's all, you don't have to pull any cash out of your pocket, nothing.
That's smart. Yeah. Very cool. That is really good. Yeah. The economies of scale is, kind of obvious, but sometimes takes a little time for people to get it in there. Tell me, I'm really curious about the driverless trend that we're starting to see now.
Yeah.
Some cities have they have zones for driverless taxis and whatnot.
That's right. Vegas has that. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about what you guys have seen in mass transit.
Yeah. So it's an exciting time. I mean, it's a little scary, it's like Minority Report stuff, where if your vehicle is autonomously controlled, can somebody hack into it, or can the government shut you down or whatever? But let's talk about the technology, what's happening. Yeah. So, a lot of people know Elon Musk, kind of invented these Tesla cars, which also have an autonomous version where you can maybe take your hands off the wheel at certain times and let it drive itself. Well, that technology has continued to be advanced. Right. And so now there's small buses that are available with manufacturers from around the world where you can pre-program routes, which is the most common thing. So it's on a pre-programmed route. So let's say you're in, Houston, Texas, where it's boiling hot, and you're on a college campus, and you don't want to walk from the parking lot, which is a quarter mile from your building. An autonomous vehicle could run around, pick you up, and take you up and drop you off at a bus stop right in front of your, right in front of your building. Now they're even going further, though, Doug. Now they're making it so that they can, using LiDAR, which is laser radar, and other technologies, it can sense the road, it can sense rain, it can sense people, and it can drive itself even beyond a pre-programmed route You can have it come to where you're at through a phone app, etc. They're testing these in a place in Jacksonville, Florida. We covered it on our Transit Unplugged TV show. I went down there. They have a test and learn facility, JTA does, where they're running them through their paces and sending back the information to the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, to make sure that they're really working for transit agencies. And most transit agencies in the country are starting to pilot that. They're having trouble getting enough drivers. There's also routes where you can't fit a big bus.
You don't need driver? What do you mean?
Right. Well, for their regular service. So they can't get enough drivers. So they're saying, in some circumstances where it's small areas, easy to get around with a smaller vehicle, and we can't get enough drivers for our circulators, we'll put on an autonomous vehicle. Now, almost all of them still have somebody on the bus, kind of like a safety concierge to welcome people on. But eventually, it is coming. I mean, I was just in Dubai last year, and Cruise, GM, General Motors Company Cruise, which is already doing this in San Francisco, is mapping out all of the city of Dubai. And in next year, they'll have completely driverless taxi cabs with no steering wheel, and it'll pick you up. And I mean, wow. I mean, the science fiction is now becoming more science than fiction.
It is, and I think that the generational jump with that will be much faster as we go. Right now, we're used to having driverless trams at airports, right?
That's right.
Those trains have been driverless for years.
Yep.
So we might go, okay, that's okay. Off the rails, you and I, I'm like, it's a little bit, I'm not sure about this. But I guarantee you, I'm sure that my kids and my grandkids be like, why would you drive?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like easy.
Yeah. I just got back from Honolulu for another episode of our show, Transit Unplugged TV, where I filmed the nation's first autonomous elevated train. It's taken them 30 years, Doug, to get it built. And it's going live now in April for passengers. And it goes to Honolulu and out 10 miles, and they're going to add another 10 miles later. But again, their train is going to have nobody on it. No driver, no conductor.
Why is that a big deal? There's no driver and conductor at Chicago's train.
That's right. That's right. Or at Denver's airport on the little trains in between terminals. Yeah, you're right. It shouldn't be a big deal, but it is the first real one in America. So kind of exciting. We're headed there. I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be having drones drop off packages. We'll be having, autonomous vehicles come pick you up. It's going to be a whole new world, a brave new world, as they say.
That's right. That's right. What's been the biggest challenge with the your main book here, the equity and inclusion piece? Let's go back to that for a second. I'm curious about what the biggest challenges you've seen in the ecosystem of other transit people. What's been the biggest hurdle they had to go over?
Yeah, it is changing our focus. I think is that, change is always different, right? Is difficult. So with ridership down dramatically and fares down dramatically, the federal government had to step up. And I don't know if most people are aware, the federal government passed several big packages. One was called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Last year. There was a lot of talk about it on the news, and that increased federal funding to transit. So basically, during the pandemic, public transportation had largely been a local responsibility. Correct. Cities had paid for their own transit systems with a little bit of help from the federal government for capital expenses, bricks and mortar buildings, buses, rail systems. But the operating dollars came from the fare box, maybe some advertising on the vehicles, and then subsidies from local government. So that changed, though, during the pandemic. And the federal government realized, you know what? Public transportation really is like a national priority, kind of like the FAA created airlines to be a national priority. And so they really ramped up their support for it. That Bipartisan Infrastructure Act included inside of it a 5-year Transportation Reauthorization Act, which increased the base level of funding from the federal government to public transit agencies across America by 40%. The biggest leap in funding in history. And so the federal government basically is prior. I was just in Washington, D.C. this last week. I met with the heads of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. They are committed now to seeing public transportation as a national priority, not just a local responsibility anymore.
Interesting.
So that's kind of that came out of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because they realized for our economy to run, we've got to have strong public mobility, because there are many people who don't have a second car in their family, or maybe no car at all. And they need mobility to get to run societal needs, these essential jobs we talked about.
Yes, right. I can't say that phrase either.
I know.
When it comes to the, I'm curious about the free version, right? So we go, it ends up being like, I'm going to pay for my neighbor's transportation, right? That's the idea of overall tax to support postal service, FAA, and transportation. would that be a blanket free for everybody? Even a rich guy will get a free ride then, or is it going to be segmented?
So here's how that's playing out. It's a very good question. And that's the main concern people have with going to zero fare transit is, well, not everybody uses it. It's kind of like a public golf course run by the county government or the city government. It's not subsidized. It's paid for by user fees, right? That cover the cost. So the idea that many cities have turned to, though, is that mobility is such an essential function. It should be more analogous to public education, more like to parks and to other services that are basically free. However, here's how they're differentiating, as you mentioned, between the rich guys, so to speak, or whatever. So use Washington, D.C. as an example. The city council voted 13-0 a few months ago to make bus service in the District of Columbia free, but not the rail. The rail you still pay for because that's where the commuters coming into the city would use it. So the downtown central business districts basically creating a free circulator service. Other cities have this across the world. I was in Melbourne a few years ago before the pandemic, and they've had free tram service downtown. It also makes it quicker to get on and quicker to get off, Doug. There's big queues of people getting in line. Sometimes it could take you 2 or 3 minutes to get everybody to drop their 50 cents in the fare. It doesn't even make sense. I just talked to a guy the other day who runs a system outside of Boston, and he's like, Paul, after we hired the armored car, we paid for the counters, the police protection. We were only collecting 27 cents off every dollar that we were collecting. It didn't make sense. And so that's what a lot of cities are coming to conclusion of. Not everyone, and it won't work for everyone. Some of the bigger cities are going to have to continue to have faring. But mid-sized and smaller cities that didn't rely on the fare box a whole lot to begin with, it's becoming a more reasonable option for them.
But how do you segment that by geography? That doesn't, that totally segregates us. That's not integrating society. If we're holding like the Washington D.C. hub people, you pay and the buses are free. Well, what if I'm a janitor at the Capitol building, man?
And I need to ride the subway system, you mean? Yeah, that's a very good question. So other systems are looking at, and a lot of them already have it in place, low-income subsidies, subsidized services, and people with disabilities, subsidized services. So that just as you said, if you have to ride and you are in a job, which is a lower paying job, you can still afford it. Public transit is pretty reasonable as it is. Most cities is like a couple bucks to get on the bus. However, you add that up over a period of time, people who are living at subsistence level, that can give them a few extra bags of groceries if they don't have to pay. So it's a debate. I'm actually hosting a debate, Doug, in Nashville in 2 weeks, between this guy in Massachusetts that I told you about, who's going to go on there and talk about he's for zero fares, and then another guy from out west who's saying no, it makes more sense to have people continue to pay and put money into the system. And so it's a debate that's raging in our industry right now.
It's a fascinating topic because the whole postal service, I keep thinking that rural service would cost like $18 to send a letter if I had to send it out to farmland, and 2 cents locally. So I get the concept. But I think, and when it comes to delivering a letter, it is geographically bound, but economically for people, in my opinion, you should bring up your buddy in Maryland, segmenting it by geography is horrible. It's just a horrible idea to say, oh, well, you're out in the crappy area, so it's free for you. I'm like, yeah, but I work over here.
That's right. No, it shows you. It's funny. I was just talking to a guy named Peter Rogoff this week. He used to be the head of the Federal Transit Administration for the national government, and he just left Seattle. He retired as head of one of their transit systems. And I said, Peter, I've been quoting you for years. Tell me if what I'm saying is true. Did you say one time, if you've seen one transit system, you've seen one transit system? And he said, yeah, that's me. And the idea behind it is it's not like if you've seen one transit system, you've seen all systems. Every single system in America is unique and different based on the history of how it got started. Remember, public transit was in its heyday back in the 50s when all the guys came back from World War II and everyone was riding the tram system and the trolley system downtown. And then as cars came on in the 1970s, people started riding it less. And so a lot of they were privately owned transit systems run usually by the utility companies. They went belly up and they sold them to the cities on pennies on the dollar, and cities picked them up. And for 40 years, public transit systems had a monopoly on mobility. And the last 10 years, Uber, Lyft, the scooters, the bikes have all kind of come into that. And so we are in an ever-changing landscape right now. And government agencies, of course, are always a little bit slower to respond to that. So that's what all this controversy and thought. That's why I called the book Conversations, because there's lots of conversations going on about how do we make this work. Maybe we make a little bit too much of an effort here, and then we got to dial back, or we're not doing enough over there. So it's a microcosm of society. It's really interesting. And most people that work in the transit industry kind of fell into it.
Yeah.
So, and there's hundreds of thousands of people that work here. So it is an interesting time.
Very cool. Very cool. Hold the book up again. Let's plug your book and get that out for people who want to get this book. Conversations on Equity, Inclusion, and Public Transportation by Paul Comfort. Paul, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. And have a good day.
Awesome. Thank you.
You bet. That concludes our show for today. I'm your host, Doug Crowe, with the Author Brand Show, where you're going to want to take notes. And if you didn't take notes, all you do is click below, and the show notes are there, along with Paul's book, which I highly recommend. Have a good day, and thanks for joining us.